Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Aisha Subarkash. 14 years ago, Russia invaded a neighboring country, carving out a separatist enclave that it has supported militarily and diplomatically ever since. Last week, Georgia's breakaway region of South Ossetia held a presidential election that much of the world has not recognized. Georgia's foreign ministry described the vote as another illegal act by Russia directed against Georgia's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Georgia was the first country to officially leave the Soviet Union in April 1991 and pursued a path towards the West. Back in 2008, Russian troops invaded South Ossetia in Georgia's north, routing its army before ultimately taking control of the area. The Kremlin quickly recognized the region as an independent state. Since then, Moscow has provided South Ossetia with financial support and offered Russian passports to its residents. And officials in the region have proposed the idea of formally joining their northern neighbor. So, can the lessons of Georgia play a role in understanding Moscow's long-term plans when it comes to Ukraine and the country's breakaway regions in the east? And to answer that, joining me now from Pittsburgh is Jennifer Murtazashvili. She is the director at the Center for Governance and Markets and an associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh. And from Jakarta, James Dorsey. He is a senior fellow at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University. A warm welcome to you both, and thank you very much for joining me on the program. Jennifer, what do you make of the latest elections held in South Ossetia and its de facto leaders, Bibilov's pledge to hold a referendum on the breakaway region's possibility of joining Russia?
Well, this is clearly a play by Russia to try to solidify its positions in Georgia. I think that they are reeling from the losses in Ukraine and fear losses in Georgia. You know, there has been sentiments within Georgia recently, calls within Georgia to now finally, move to take back South Ossetia from Russia. So I think this is really a defensive move. What really appears to be an aggressive move by Russia to, integrate South Ossetia as part of Russia. This is actually a defensive move because I think Russia is really insecure in its position, not just in South Ossetia, but among so many of these enclaves or exclaves that it holds throughout much of the former Soviet Union.
So, but James, would Russia favor such a move at a time when it's dealing with the Ukraine crisis and trying to overcome the crippling effects of Western sanctions?
Well, first of all, I think that Western sanctions aren't going to be what makes the difference in the Russian decision on this. I think at the same time, rather than necessarily seeing this as a sign of weakness, one could also see it as a sign of being determined to move forward with creating what Vladimir Putin views as the Russian world. So, with other words, this elections in various regions that the Russians claim as being primarily Russian is straight out of the Russian playbook.
So, on the other hand, most of the Western world called the elections illegal and unconstitutional. The U.S. Embassy in Georgia released a statement saying the United States does not recognize the legitimacy of the so-called presidential elections held in Georgia's South Ossetia region on April 10th and will not acknowledge their outcome. And it closes with stating, "We therefore call upon Russia to immediately stop its war in Ukraine and its occupation of Georgia and fulfill all of its obligations under the 2008 ceasefire agreement, including withdrawal of its forces to pre-conflict positions." So, Jennifer, the U.S. has directly linked what's happening in Georgia now with the conflict in Ukraine. Would you agree? And is this the part of the Russian strategy towards former Soviet unions?
Absolutely. I mean, this is something that we've seen in so many different parts of the former Soviet Union, where Russia is really trying to have an influence or take territory. So this call by, and I think what's really important here for us to recognize is that it's not just that there are elections taking place in South Ossetia; it's that some of the leadership are calling for unification with Russia, and this is really a very dramatic step. Hearing these local politicians talk about these issues, so this area is not even recognized. These elections are not recognized internationally, and so I think that it is a very worrisome step.
So, James, how would the these two breakaway regions, South Ossetia and Abkhazia's possible incorporation into Russia impact Georgia's efforts to become a member of NATO? Will it make it harder for Georgia to join the alliance moving forward?
I don't think it will make it harder. It may even, in fact, propel it. Fact of the matter is that what we're dealing with is what Vladimir Putin frames as the Russian world. With other words, he defines borders no longer in national terms, but in civilizational terms. Russia's borders, in his mind, are determined by wherever you have Russian speakers or those who adhere to Russian culture. And I think that what you'll see probably is that unless you get a situation in Georgia that you get in Ukraine, where NATO membership is the red line for Putin, and therefore NATO is backed off, and the Ukrainians have basically backed off NATO membership. If you get that situation again in Georgia, then you will also see a backing away from the NATO alliance. More probably is some sort of discussion with the European Union, which seems to be the compromise formula here.
So, Jennifer, would you agree with James? It would propel Western powers to include Georgia in NATO? Because until this latest crisis in Ukraine, Western countries have limited themselves to condemning these Russia-backed separatist movements. What could they do differently now?
So I think I might disagree here. I think if we look at U.S. behavior in Ukraine, that, you look at Ukraine has stepped away from NATO membership. I don't think that the United States and NATO want direct military confrontation with Russia. And I think if the U.S. or the European partners would pursue NATO membership in Georgia, that would be seen as direct confrontation by Vladimir Putin. And I don't think that they want that kind of step right now. But it would mean, I think, potentially accelerated membership towards the European Union, very similar to what we're seeing in Ukraine, potentially bringing Georgia, more closely into these alliances. But on the other hand, we have to recognize that the government in Georgia right now is as pro-Russian as it's been in many years. And so I think that this is another dynamic we haven't spoken about that would really impede some of these efforts. And it will be interesting to watch internal political dynamics, looking at Georgian Dream, the political movement that's running the country right now, that has been, very slow to criticize Russia's aggression in Ukraine. So this is something really to watch out for as well.
But James, the question is, does Russia really want to see South Ossetia become another Russian province? Because the Kremlin has never been quite eager to merge with the region. Earlier this month, actually, the Kremlin said both regions shall be less dependent on Moscow's finances. Why is that?
Well, I think that, again, returning to the concept of a Russian world, ultimately, I believe that is what the Russians want. It may very well be that in the intermediate stage, they're happy to have regions like Abkhazia or South Ossetia be dependent on Russia, but not fully integrated into Russia. And of course, South Ossetia and Abkhazia are a different ballgame as compared to Crimea or much of affinity that Russia feels with Ukraine. However, at the end of the day, this is about creating a sphere of influence. And that sphere of influence is defined as a Russian world.
So, Jennifer, is the Russian army expanding its presence in the region, pushing border markings deeper into Georgia? What's the current situation there? And what's at stake for the strategic Baku-Supsa pipeline, which transfers crude oil from Caspian Sea to the Black Sea?
Right, it puts a lot of those things certainly at risk, and we're seeing, certain Russian aggression increasing in the region. And to answer this previous question, I think is a really important one. Is Russia, on the one hand, is putting a lot of pressure on these regions right now, financially, and Russia. I think this illustrates the weakness that Russia has right now, is that it cannot sustain a lot of this military aggression. It has lost so many troops inside of Ukraine. So if we look at Russian military positions inside of Georgia. Although there have been aggressive moves in recent weeks and recent months, is this sustainable on Russia's part? And I'm not entirely sure that that is the case. Russia has a lot of commitments, all over the region, and given the heavy losses it's sustained and the sanctions, I think there are big questions about its ability to maintain this in the long run. So I think that helps us understand why it's putting this kind of financial pressure on South Ossetia and Abkhazia.
So given Russia's commitments in the region, James, are eastern, let's say, regions of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, awaiting the same fate?
I think there's no doubt. And most probably, in fact, the Ukrainian breakaway regions are much more important to Russia than the Georgian ones. But ultimately, yes, already you've had the recognition of the independence of those regions, and you've also had the suggestion that they could be incorporated into Russia. And I think that is truly a prospect, and I think it's a prospect both for the Georgian regions as well as for the Ukrainian regions. I think the one thing that one needs to point out, and I don't doubt the military failure in some ways in Ukraine, as well as the losses sustained, but we really don't know what Russia can sustain or not, and time will tell us.
So, Jennifer, how much of today's situation linked to the West's complacency and inaction towards Russia, especially when it invaded in 2008?
Well, I think that there's a lot of blame. What the United States did was very badly distracted by wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, was not paying attention to what was going on in Georgia and in Ukraine, for that matter. Of course, there was political attention to these matters, but there was still a sense that Russia was evolving, Russia was changing, and it's only been the past several years that we clearly understand that it's really difficult to work with Putin, and his beliefs and his ideas, as my colleague here has pointed out, are really not compatible with so many of United States strategies and NATO strategies and so forth. So there's been a massive, neglect of looking at these issues in a very serious way.
All right, Jennifer and James, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.